welcome. We've been talking about what conditions the EU will hold Sri Lanka to if the EU GSP Plus concession is extended, or what the Western powers expect Sri Lanka to comply with. To discuss all that and more, I've invited to our studios head of the delegation of the European Union in Sri Lanka and also accredited to the Maldives, Ambassador Denis Chaibi. A very warm welcome to our show at Hyde Park on Ada Derana 24. Ayubowan.
Ayubowan, thank you very much for having me.
It's wonderful to have you. I know you've been traveling extensively here in Sri Lanka. You like to cycle around. Tell us a little about your experiences. During the pandemic time, were you still able to travel?
I respected all the rules of the government, and these rules were quite drastic. If you remember April, May 2020, but it worked. The government managed very well the COVID crisis and is now the latest number 104 on the fatality rate, which is pretty good for a country like Sri Lanka. But once the restrictions were lifted, I was able to almost every weekend go with my car and the bicycle in the back and cycle all around Sri Lanka, which is a true pleasure.
Yeah. Do you drive?
I drive everywhere and I'm still alive, so I'm very happy.
That's wonderful. It must be quite an experience to drive here in Sri Lanka.
It is quite an experience indeed.
Ambassador, let's talk a little about Sri Lanka, your observations. You've been here since 2019, towards the end of 2019, of course, after the horrific attacks here, but also prior to an important election, the presidential election. Tell us about your observation when you came in. You may have been briefed about the Sri Lanka's political, socio-economic situation. And today, after a pandemic situation, where Sri Lanka is. Let's start off there.
Well, first of all, it was a great honor for me to be appointed ambassador to Sri Lanka. I had been to Sri Lanka before as a tourist in 2015. And I traveled with tuk-tuk, buses and train. I had taken the train from Colombo to Matara. So I had very good memories of Sri Lanka. I was more or less informed that my appointment would go through just after the attacks. And obviously I was very shaken. There were lots of Europeans who either died or were injured. And therefore it was quite a challenge to be prepared to go to a country that had gone through such a horrendous attack. I was very grateful. The authorities accredited me very quickly, so I could present my credential to then President Sirisena very quickly. And then we engaged very quickly with the government, the new government of President Rajapaksa. The first thing that came was a bit difficult for us because it was the withdrawal of the co-sponsorship of the Human Rights Council Resolution 30/1. And as EU, we are convinced that reconciliation is important for Sri Lanka and that therefore the co-sponsorship was a positive step. The government promised to have its own reconciliation process, and I must say that the last year and a half has been marked by a constructive engagement with the government in order to see if this own reconciliation process was bearing fruits.
Let's talk a little about Sri Lanka's own reconciliation process. What are your observations as ambassador? Are you satisfied with the efforts the government has made so far?
So the efforts for reconciliation have several tracks. There's the Human Rights Council track, and that's for the UN to discuss. For us, the EU, it has been the GSP Plus track. I have to explain very carefully that GSP Plus is not an imposition. We are not imposing GSP Plus to the government. It's the government that applied in 2016 to get GSP Plus back. It had been withdrawn in 2010. And so it applied, and in 2017, the deal was that there would be a number of commitments made by Sri Lanka autonomously, and one of these commitments was to bring the PTA in line with international standards. So it's not an imposition from the EU. It's Sri Lanka's own decision and its own reconciliation process and its own reform in terms of human rights and governance. So now the government has tabled a possible reform of the PTA. So what the EU did on the 8th of February, we had a joint commission, a high-level meeting where we noted and welcomed the fact that this amendment has been, these amendments have been tabled, but we noted that some elements were still missing And so we invited the Sri Lankan authorities to do more regarding this reform.
Sri Lanka did apply for EU GSP+, but at the same time there's a lot of discussion and debate about the kind of conditions Sri Lanka will be subjected to if Sri Lanka is to regain this concession. But for example, Professor G.L. Pires himself responded that it would make Sri Lanka vulnerable, in the sense we have a lot of citizens, a population who will be affected as a result. So do you think it's fair to subject Sri Lanka to these conditions when Sri Lanka is making efforts and there is a process of homegrown reconciliation process?
So first of all, Sri Lanka at the moment enjoys a tariff-free access to the EU. So in principle, countries that export to the EU have to pay 24% tariff. At the moment, the Sri Lankan exporters don't pay this on a high number of tariff lines. So most of the products that come from Sri Lanka to Europe don't pay this tariff. Now, there's no condition subjected to Sri Lanka. It's Sri Lanka who decides, totally autonomously and in full sovereignty, to apply to have this reduction and to commit. But it's, it's not for the sake of the EU. We believe that what's important in terms of human rights governance, it's also labor conventions, environmental standards, is good for the Sri Lankans themselves. It's not, we are not imposing this for our benefit. We believe that if Sri Lanka is interested in taking these commitments, it's for its own citizens. So we don't see that as imposing conditions. It's Sri Lanka who autonomously applies. Now, what you're talking about is what happens if the GSP Plus is withdrawn. And obviously, I don't want to start to speculate. Clearly, the importance of GSP Plus for a certain category of the population is an important factor that we are looking at. But ultimately, it's the facts on the ground regarding human rights, international labor standards and environmental conventions.
The PTA also, the government says, is being amended in order to bring it in line with international norms and standards. Is this positively looked at by the international community, especially the European Union region?
So the EU has been very clear in its assessment. We welcome the submission by the government of Sri Lanka of this amendment, but there are some elements that have not been included, and therefore we are still continuing our constructive engagement with the Sri Lankan authorities, and in particular with Mr. Pires, to see how we can make further progress.
These elements, if you may elaborate on these, Ambassador, what specifically you want Sri Lanka to comply with? So
there are things that are non-PTA, such as, in terms of labor conventions, there should be a new law on anti-discrimination. There should be the removal of forced labor as a possible penalty. There should be more measures in terms of freedom of association. But on the PTA itself, the things that are really important is, for example, the non-admissibility of the confessions made during the detention, the administrative detention, because there's always a risk that these confessions are forced. There's the possibility of having direct access to a legal counsel. Now, there is something in the amendment, but it's not, immediate and automatic. That would be a very good provision. There's also the possibility of reinforced judicial oversight. The judge must feel empowered that they can scrutinize any case, including PTAs.
Overall, the climate, the environment of Sri Lanka, how do you observe the situation here in Sri Lanka?
In terms of?
In terms of democracy, rule of law, good governance?
Well, that's the ongoing process, and that's the GSP Plus report that will be issued later in the year that will go very deep into that. What I can say is we had this official meeting on the 8th of February. The tone was engaged, it was constructive, and we are looking forward to a further conversation. So it's really a work in progress, and we are very happy to continue this conversation with the authorities. On the economic side, Sri Lanka is facing severe challenges, especially when we talk about the Forex issue, the crisis. We have exporters, we have an import ban in place, and exports also. There are challenges, especially because of the dearth in foreign exchange, foreign currency. How will the EU look to play a part in supporting Sri Lanka going forward? So first of all, we are strong partners of Sri Lanka in all forms of support. Over the last 20 years, we have shared grants, not loans, grants of more than $1 billion or €1 billion.
Where Sri Lanka does not have to pay interest or
it has been project, it has been things. So, for example, between 2014 and 2021, we spent more than €200 million, with more than 50% of that going to rural development, so mainly agriculture. You know, we have developed apps to reinforce the yields, to have the weather connected, to predict the prices. We have worked very much with the Ministry of Agriculture to have an overarching agricultural policy. We have developed a project for better entrepreneurship in growing coffee or having a dairy industry. So we've done a lot. We've done also a lot on reconciliation, seminars, leadership. Now, the way forward for 2021 to 2028 will be about green economy, green recovery. So we're going to try to have to work with local companies here, big and small, on doing renewable energies, circular economy, recycling plastic and things. We're doing a lot on tourism, encouraging tourism, working very closely with the Minister of Tourism and the chairwoman of SLTDA. And I'd like to make this point that when you have a woman in charge, things are going very well in Sri Lanka. So we are working with Mrs. Kimali Fernando, and with all our energy, we are, I think, doing really well in bringing back tourists. So we are doing a lot of things with Sri Lanka, despite the fact that there's an import ban that hit European products in a very discriminatory way. Our products are not coming through, whereas the exports of Sri Lanka are still going well to Europe thanks to GSP+. But despite that, we are still supporting very effectively and with grants the Sri Lankan economy.
We understand the concerns of some of the biggest European Union countries of the likes of Germany, who raised a voice about the lack of exports or rather imports from Germany to Sri Lanka. But at the same time, Sri Lanka is going through a crisis situation, trying to manage the economic crisis, the Forex crisis, and trying to feed the people of the country. In terms of foreign exchange and in investment is key here. Is there any way or platform that European investors are looking at Sri Lanka currently, or are there challenges to investment? For a long time we've been talking about bureaucracy, red tape. This is something the EU has raised. But currently, as we move to improve our foreign currency reserves and uplift Sri Lanka's economic situation, how would you assess the investment climate here?
Yeah, first of all, we have a platform. I mean, Sri Lanka has the BOI, which helps investors and is certainly a platform that has a high value. But we, as EU, we have an investors dialogue with the government. It was held very regularly since 2014, with a peak of activity 2017, 2019. And then with COVID, elections and all that, it took a bit of a backseat. But we had the latest one recently, 31st of January, with Minister Basil Rajapaksa and other ministers, and it was very fruitful. We could solve a number of issues and flag the hindrances for future investors. But I think if you are a European investor and you want to come to Sri Lanka, which has a lot of things to offer, you want an open and fair legal environment so that there's no discrimination between Sri Lankans and foreigners in terms of investment. You want stable, that the laws don't change. You want them to be predictable. So, for example, you can repatriate your profits, or at least a part, and it doesn't change. You want to have laws that are clear, not that one law says something and another law said something else, and then there's a contradiction and you need to go before a judge.
Right.
So these are the key elements for a very good business environment in Sri Lanka, but we are convinced that Sri Lanka has a lot to offer in terms of investment potential.
Have there been any concerns from investors, potential investors, about, especially when we talk about consistent policy? You've been talking about laws, predictability. In these areas, have there been any concerns?
I think the main concern for an investor, I'm not an investor, I don't have the means, but if I were an investor, I would be very focused on the Forex. If I cannot convert my Forex easily and bring it back to my shareholders, I have a company, I have shareholders, they are investing in exchange of a return on their investment. If this return on investment cannot be brought back in foreign currency, then it will be a concern for any investor.
So I presume there will be a lot of support, as I asked you earlier, from the European Union for Sri Lanka to work out the situation currently.
Yes, we are working very closely with the authorities, but I think the authorities are faced with difficult decisions in the months to come, especially in terms of reimbursement of the debt. The EU, as EU, doesn't have any debt towards Sri Lanka, so it's mainly for Sri Lanka to discuss with its main creditors rather than us.
You did mention that EU support to Sri Lanka over the years have been grants and not loans, you stressed. Is the European Union continually concerned about Sri Lanka's situation of moving into a debt trap?
A debt trap is a characterization that has been associated with perhaps certain countries, and it doesn't concern the EU. What is clear is if you have a public debt that is close to 100% of your GDP, you have to think about how to rationalize that debt. So, for example, the country I know best, Belgium, we had a debt at 120% public debt. So we started a program of rationalization of expenditures, and we were lucky enough to be part of the euro and to have a more manageable debt, and we committed to have maximum 3% of fiscal deficit every year. So we took a number of measures to manage that debt, and I assume that the government is looking at the same set of measures. The only thing is that with COVID and the economic impact of COVID, they could not implement that early, and now it's for them to decide. It's not for the EU to prescribe any policy, but we have been there and we know that there's a way out. Now it's for the government to manage that.
In terms of Sri Lanka's debt crisis and moving out of this, the European Union has been engaging, the US and the European Union, with Sri Lanka, China, India. We have superpowers, we have Japan, we have some of the strongest powers in Sri Lanka, investing in Sri Lanka. Is there also any questions on the part of involvement of countries and the share of involvement of countries in Sri Lanka for especially investment projects?
Well, we in the European Union are not so much focused on the investments of other countries in Sri Lanka. We are focused on the possibilities for all investors, and as I said, we are interested in an open and fair environment, clear, predictable. What we want is an interaction with the world. If there are more people investing in Sri Lanka and it brings welfare to Sri Lankans, so much the better. I think the main concern is that it's fair for everyone, that it's a level playing field. And another thing that is very close to the heart of the EU, and especially cycling all around Sri Lanka, I'm very sensitive to that, is the environmental impact. Sri Lanka is one of the most vulnerable countries in the world in terms of climate change. If I remember the first time I came, 2015, and now the erosion on all the beach, either Unawatuna or Tangol or Hikadua, you see the buildings are very close to the road, and therefore the sea cannot prolong, so it's more abrupt and it takes away sand. I can see that it's a very vulnerable country to climate change, and so economic interests have to be managed in a way that take into account the long-term sustainability impact.
The present government has made it clear that moving or working with the IMF or going into an IMF bailout program is not the solution for the country to come out of the present economic challenge. You did speak about a proven solution that could be implemented in Sri Lanka. But what is your view on the question of the IMF?
On the IMF, European states, so the member states of the European Union, have quite a number of voting rights. So they believe in the IMF, they are part of the IMF as individual member states, not as EU. So therefore, being so much involved in the IMF, they would always recommend, member states would always recommend the IMF expertise for any problem. Having said that, the EU as EU, we are not member of the IMF, we don't have an official position, and it's really for the government of Sri Lanka to determine the best way forward. But I know that the member states are involved in the IMF and are always recommending that people turn to IMF expertise for macroeconomic solutions.
I think it's time we take a short commercial break here at Hyde Park. To stay with us, we are in conversation with the EU ambassador to Sri Lanka and the Maldives, Denis Chaibi. Welcome back. You're joining us here at Hyde Park on AdaDerana 24. Ambassador, you were talking extensively about the importance of ensuring climate, environmental sustainability here in Sri Lanka, whether we talk about economics or tourism. I see that you love to travel. You visited Sri Lanka even before you were posted here as ambassador. But in terms of tourism, tourism had took a double blow after the Easter Sunday attacks. It was hard hit, and again, now due to the pandemic, Sri Lanka had no choice but to keep our shores, borders closed. Moving forward, what steps do you think we should take in order to achieve sustainable tourism going forward, in order to ensure that Sri Lanka also sustains this destination as a high-end market, especially with the European tourists?
Yeah, it's a subject very close to the heart of Europeans. First of all, Europeans provide a very large number of tourists to Sri Lanka, and I'm going to blow the trumpet of Europeans here, but they stay longer, they spend more, they go for higher quality, and I think that they're very respectful of Sri Lankans. So I think European tourists can be proud of what they bring to Sri Lanka. Now, as European taxpayers, they have provided Sri Lanka with roughly almost 6 million euros, so more than 1.4 billion rupees at the official rate. And what we are doing with that is precisely sustainable tourism. So we are looking, for example, at this Serendipity Trail. We have opened a trail that ultimately will be 300 kilometers long, part of even a wider network where people can walk all around Kandy and have a beautiful view. So I inaugurated with Mrs. Fernando very recently the first 20 kilometers, and it's beautiful. You're above Kandy, you start from the Ceylon Tea Museum, and you have views of Kandy, then you have views of Digana, and then you stop in a small village, you have Tamil food, it's excellent, and then you go on for another 20 kilometers. So this is something that we are doing, and you know, if you look at Santiago de Compostela in Spain, it had 5,000 visitors 30 or 40 years ago, and now there's more than 300,000 or 400,000. So this could be fantastic for Sri Lankan tourism. With this funding, the almost 6 million euro, we are also investing a lot in wellness. So we're going to do a big digital campaign with a top photographer to promote wellness as an experience. And overall, what we want to work on with the Sri Lankan authorities is that tourism from an industry becomes an experience, and that it helps to brand Sri Lanka as a very high quality things. I think that for Sri Lanka, quantity is never the solution, it's quality, and we want to do this journey with the Sri Lankans on tourism.
You did talk about a digital campaign on wellness. We understand most of the European tourists are quite interested in the wellness side of tourism, especially Germans to most of the Europeans. Is this done by the European Union itself? Is this program sponsored by the European Union? Or are you working in collaboration with the tourism authority?
So the campaign is basically paid by the EU, so we've done the terms of reference, we have adjudicated, we have given the contract to a company, but it's very much determined by the SLTDA, the Sri Lankan Tourism Development Association, Tourism Authority, sorry. And really what they want is a very good stock of images that they can use and reuse on digital platforms, influencers, and this kind of thing. So it's the appeal of a beautiful image of Sri Lanka that we are paying in full.
That's interesting. Are we also expecting any grants or funds coming into Sri Lanka this year, and to what tune would that be?
There are also small grants for Sri Lankan tourism operators to help them to overcome the crisis of COVID. But overall, we have much more funding coming. We're still spending the 200 million I mentioned from 2014 to 2021. It's still going. And there's one program I'd really like to highlight because we launched it 2 days ago with Minister Sabri, is the Justice Program. So it's 18 million euros, so a massive program. And it's about the modernization of justice, so it's about digitalization, it's about access, so that Sri Lankans can have a quicker and better access to justice, especially looking at vulnerable groups, women, children. is to improve the efficiency of judges through training, a new technique, and also to have policy dialogue. How can we keep improving? So with Minister Sabri, we have a very strong partner, and we are trying to really empower the judges for the benefit of the Sri Lankan society at large.
In terms of trade, although Sri Lanka does not import from the European Union at the present moment, we're still looking at expanding trade with the European Union, especially to address the Forex crisis. But what avenues do you see here?
Once again, I'll come back to this image of quality rather than quantity. The thing that struck me even more now that I live here is that everything that grows in Sri Lanka is the best. You have the best cinnamon in the world, and in this regard, the EU now is going to protect the geographical indication. So there will be a pure Ceylon cinnamon, and only Sri Lanka will be able to use that term. So that means that the high price of cinnamon will remain or can go even higher because there's this quality label recognized by the EU. So this is a fantastic marketing tool, and it helps to put Sri Lanka on the map of quality rather than quantity. But we could do that with the tea is the best in the world. We could do that with the pepper, we could do that with the ginger, we could do that with the tambili.
Tambili, of course. Do you think Ceylon tea has not captured the European Union as it should have?
I think
the European market, rather.
I think especially the big exporters, the big brand names are doing a wonderful job, but their price point being high, they can even do better with a stronger marketing. So we are really confident that if the Ceylon tea get also a protection, it's not for today or tomorrow, but perhaps in a couple of years, that would be another way to increase the revenues from tea from Sri Lanka.
You spoke about Ceylon tea, Ceylon cinnamon, but I'd like to ask you, as a foreign national, we've been continuing to brand our products under the Ceylon brand name. But again, there have been discussion about doing away with Ceylon or going with Sri Lanka. How would you look at this as an outsider to the country in terms of what's more closer to you? What appeals more to the discerning EU customer?
I think I'm not representative of a focus group. I think that the marketeers have to do focus group and see what resonates. I think that both names have interesting connotations. In Europe, Ceylon doesn't have negative connotation, so it's perceived very positively, but at the same time the name of the country is Sri Lanka. So it's really for Sri Lankans to determine. I think the overwhelming reason should be the return on investment, and therefore if there's more sales with Sri Lanka than to go for Sri Lanka, if there's more sale for Ceylon. But it's a brand. It's, you know, it's not something that people should look too much into it. It's a brand, and what is the best brand for the country?
I'd like to go back to the question on investments. Are we expecting any investments, sizable investments into the country from parts of the European Union? Is the delegation aware of any ongoing projects?
So the European Union delegation doesn't really deal with private investors' preparation. That's much more for member states. So I know that France, Germany, Netherlands, Italy, Romania are always looking at bringing investments here. You know, France has Decathlon, Michelin, I mean big companies that have production facilities, and I'm sure that they are always looking at the market, but it's really for them to say to you if there are more investments coming.
Right, it's time we take a short break. To stay with us. Welcome back. We're in conversation with the head of the delegation of the European Union in Sri Lanka. Ambassador, I'd like to go back to discuss a little about the human rights topic once again. European countries and the United States. You have been in the US you've taught at Yale, and you're originally from Morocco, if I'm not mistaken. Yes. Okay, and you lived in the US, is it?
I lived in the US when I was at Yale, and my last posting was in Washington, D.C.
Right. Do you bring a lot of US ideology here to Sri Lanka?
I work for the European Union, and so I defend the European Union values.
Right. I'd like to go back to the question on human rights. European countries in the US call for accountability and reconciliation since the end of conflict, especially concerning the final stages of the war and the mechanisms to be implemented. However, a key atrocity during the war, child soldiers, has this been ignored by the European Union?
In what sense? In the sense that we've not taken sanctions, or
that the European Union or the US has not taken interest in addressing or bringing accountability to these atrocities, and also a key trainer of the LTT child soldiers is freely living in the UK.
So the first element to point out is that the EU listed LTT as a terrorist organization, I think back in 2005, and it has been on the list since then, despite numerous legal challenges, and because all listing of organization as terrorist organization has to be based on facts that are and documents that are available to all, which is not always easy because sometimes these are confidential documents, but still we have always managed to keep the LTT on the list of terrorist organization in the EU. So the EU has done something about it and has been vigilant. Now, regarding the UK is not a part of the EU anymore, and I don't want to speak for the UK in that regard. I wanted to, since you mentioned about the UK and that the EU is not part of it, I'd like to talk a little about Brexit and its impact on the European Union. This might or may not be of importance to Sri Lanka, but of course we've enjoyed very strong ties with the UK and the European Union. Indeed, but as you said, the EU is not part of the UK, and I would reverse and say the UK is no longer part of the EU. It's a sovereign choice of the UK. I've studied in the UK. My son is British, so obviously it's a topic very close to my heart. But it's the decision by the UK. What it matters for Sri Lanka is that Sri Lankan exporters before could use UK as a platform to distribute all their products in the EU based on the single market concept. Now, since the UK is no longer part of the EU, it cannot be the gateway for the EU products as a single market. So that has quite an impact on Sri Lankan exporters. Now it is for the government of Sri Lanka and the government of the UK to define their future trade relationship. At the moment the UK has a scheme that is similar to GSP+, but it is looking at it and will define a new trade relation with Sri Lanka.
The EU has been looking at free trade agreements with countries, and Sri Lanka too. Will this support Sri Lanka going forward, or is the GSP Plus more beneficial in your view?
At this stage, one has to consider the GSP Plus as a better avenue than an FTA, because an FTA means that you have to accept all the products, from Europe. And you know, those products, if they are very competitively priced, they would be sold more. So you mentioned the Forex crisis. There's an import ban, and the concept of an import ban is very difficult. It's not compatible with an FTA. So there's a long way before an FTA could be envisaged.
There have been concerns and questions about whether the import ban should be lifted. Several countries in the European Union have called for the ban to be lifted. We spoke about this earlier in our discussion. But is the European Union of the view that the ban should be lifted amid a Forex crisis?
So there are some rules governing international trade, and you know, these rules are important because they allow the exchanges to go unimpeded, to go fast, and to bring welfare to the people. So these rules in the WTO say that if you have a Forex crisis problem, you have to notify to the World Trade Organization your import ban, and then discuss it, how long it will last, to which products, and what are the measures at the end, kind of exit strategy. So these are the rules. And Sri Lanka has a different interpretation of the rules than the EU. Sri Lanka feels that it's not a ban on goods, but it's a ban on services. It's basically the payment by the bank rather than the good that is prevented. So we have a difference in interpretation, and we're trying to solve it in the WTO. But our position is that Sri Lanka should notify to the WTO its import ban, or I mean the import restrictions.
So Sri Lanka failed to notify to the WTO and other countries of the ban and steps taken within the country to regulate the situation.
So Sri Lanka feels that it doesn't have to notify because it is for services rather than for goods, and we believe that Sri Lanka should notify. We discussed this at the last Joint Commission on the 8th February. We had different opinions, and now we're going to see what are the next steps in Geneva in the World Trade Organization.
Going forward, what steps do you think Sri Lanka needs to take in order to improve the situation, economic situation here in the country? We're talking about poverty line. We're talking about impact on the population as a result of this pandemic. Many of the population who are daily wage earners lost their jobs. And at the same time, we spoke about tourism. The smallholders are forgotten. Is the EU funding and the grants, are these funding supporting SMEs and the revival of these SMEs? And how would you look at addressing this situation in the country?
No, the EU is doing a lot of SMEs, and not only for tourism, where we have a small scheme for grants, but more in Uva and Central Province, which are part of the countries that where there's sometimes concentrated poverty. So for example, we've had 3 projects of roughly 15 million euros, so again, quite a lot of money, where small entrepreneurs are given the tools, for example, a machine to get the milk from a cow, a machine to make yogurt, or the seeds of coffee. So they're given some assets, a loom to make textile. They're giving some assets, but more than that, they are trained, and when I visited, that was the most important thing for them. They are given moral support, self-confidence to go and develop their economic activities, and that's for very small companies, from 1 or 2 people, buying 2 cows and trying to have a milk going and selling, to 20, 25 people distributing yogurt, textile, things like that. So we are doing this kind of action, and we will continue to do so, but now more with a green recovery. As I said, circular economy, plastic, sorting, recycling. These are the kind of things that we want to promote in Sri Lanka.
The topic of securities of the ocean, the Indo-Pacific area, is continuing to be a hot topic, especially when we talk about threats to nations and regions and the oceans. Let's talk a little about the EU work. I understand there was a program carried out by the European Union here in Sri Lanka. Valuable lessons were shared, research was shared. But what of collaboration within this region and EU support towards that?
So yes, we had recently an event at the LKI Institute with Professor Colombage, with Professor Peris, who were kindly present throughout the event. And it just reflects the importance of the Indo-Pacific. We had a special envoy for the Indo-Pacific, Mr. Vizentin, who came here, and it was his first visit to the region as a special envoy for the Indo-Pacific. So it shows how important Sri Lanka is for the EU in this framework. Everyone has pointed to the importance of Sri Lanka, and everyone has an Indo-Pacific strategy, being Australia, Japan, China has a strategy, India, everyone has. The strategy of the EU is it is one that encourages cooperation rather than confrontation. It is a kind of open menu that proposes cooperation in 7 areas, such as digital connectivity, maritime governance. And so it's not exclusive, it's not forcing Sri Lanka to choose, but it is trying to have a good partnership with Sri Lanka in the Indian Ocean and finding a way forward. And in this regard, it's combining all the know-how of the EU and the grants and all that, but also a coordinated naval presence. So we had the ship from Germany, Bayern, the frigate Bayern, that was there in January. We will have more French ships, and we try to coordinate this so that the trade routes are very safe. And very safe trade routes are very important for Sri Lanka and for Colombo port. So we're really providing security in the Indian Ocean to the benefit of Sri Lanka.
How important is counter-radicalization work and countering violent extremism from sweeping into our parts of the region? for the European Union, especially when we saw the Easter Sunday attacks in Sri Lanka, that the extremist ideologies were not discussed in Sri Lanka, although we saw a 3-decade war in the country. But that was a civil conflict. But this is a global movement we're talking about. How important is work for the European Union in terms of working on countering violent extremism, on violent religious ideologies and counter-radicalization?
It is very important, and it is difficult for us all. Obviously, the Easter bomb attacks were terrible. I was looking at security of the EU buildings and things like that on the 22nd of March 2016, when there were attacks in Brussels. A few months before, there had been massive attacks in Paris. It goes back to even 2003, attacks in Spain, in London. There have been terrorist attacks in Europe for the last even 50 years, because you had the independent movement, or you had the communist movement. You had different movements that have used terrorism in Europe. So we are very sensitive about it. What we've done is we funded a program in Sri Lanka on countervailing extremism with the United Nations, and it has provided a good platform to exchange with the Sri Lankan authorities on how we can best handle terrorism. But one thing that is very important is, for us, we don't see a trade-off between human rights and counter-terrorism. For us, if you respect human rights, you give less opportunities to people to become terrorists, because they have less grievances. So we try, lots of people think that there's a trade-off. If you have more security, you can have less human rights. We feel that you can have both security and human rights. You have to pursue both tracks if you want to have a long-term impact on terrorism.
But there's also opinion that Sri Lanka opened up too much and allowed for such an attack to happen in Sri Lanka in terms of security. That is what has been discussed, that Sri Lanka's security apparatus broke down, weakened, allowing such a movement to take control over the country. Is there anything you want to add to that, Ambassador?
It is not for me to judge if a country opens too much or not, or the security apparatus. As I said, the best is to avoid the people to have grievances. That is the first things. If you want to eliminate the root causes of terrorism, you have to look at factors like poverty, at possibility of people to look for other avenues. People have to feel confident about the future in their country. These are the root causes. I don't want to go into the performance of the security apparatus. That is for the people of Sri Lanka to assess.
Going back to tourism, you spoke about how important EU tourists are to Sri Lanka. Of course, we need more high-end tourists visiting Sri Lanka. Are there any connectivity mismatches or issues that Sri Lanka should address?
Well, I think that you know, airport capacity, connection, flight connection, connection with other countries in the region that are doing well, such as Maldives or India, are important factors. But if I look at the way things are restarting, I think Sri Lanka is doing pretty well. The number of flights to Europe came very quickly back to its previous level, or even increasing. We have now connections, Paris, Frankfurt is coming. So the number of flights is increasing fast. The number of customers also, we are very happy that there are many Europeans, but we are also happy for Sri Lanka to receive many tourists from other places. And for example, the number of Indian tourists has exploded now in the first month, the number of tourists of Russians. But there, let's see what's going to happen now that the situation is more tense. So there are some issues, but I think that they are being settled, and the airport is being expanded with also, I think, the support of Japan. These are all factors that bode well for Sri Lanka's future in terms of tourism.
You're a career diplomat, starting at the Belgian Ministry of Foreign Affairs in 1993. Thereon, you worked at the European Commission and worked on trade, EU enlargement, South Asia, humanitarian assistance and crisis espionage, and the nuclear deal with Iran. This is quite interesting. If you may share a little about your work here.
On the Iran deal?
Yes.
So I think it's a big achievement of the EU to have negotiated on behalf of the P5, so the 5 permanent member of the UN Security Council, a deal to make sure that Iranian efforts to acquire a nuclear weapon were kept in check. It was a very good agreement. Unfortunately, the US decided to withdraw from it after the elections of President Trump. And since then we have worked very hard to try to keep this agreement in force. And now the negotiations for the US rejoining this agreement are in full swing in Vienna, and I really hope that the outcome will be positive.
You've traveled extensively. I see you're from Morocco. You've studied in the UK. That's where you studied politics and international law. And you were posted in Washington as well. And here you are in Sri Lanka. You said you've visited the Mulkidigala temple a number of times. You've cycled there.
Yes.
Where are you planning to travel in the next few years that you'll be here?
So
you've covered the island.
I've covered the island, so now it's all returns. But I still haven't been to Sinaraja Forest, and I still haven't climbed Adam's Peak. So, but there are so many more experiences. It's endless. In Sri Lanka, you can never stop. It's an island which is not so big. 65,000 kilometers is, you know, the size of two small European countries. But it has so much. Every kilometer, every turn is a surprise. And I must say, you know, from time to time, my tires get flat. I'm lost in the middle of Sri Lanka. And there's always a very nice, gentle soul to propose a tuk-tuk ride back home, or to find someone who can pump air, and always with a smile and always with a kind attention. And it's really appreciated.
Thank you very much for your time here at our studios, Ambassador. It was indeed an honor to speak with you. My pleasure. We had with us the head of the delegation of the European Union here in Sri Lanka, Ambassador Denis Chaibi, joining us at Hyde Park on AdaDerana 24 to discuss the European Union work and relations with Sri Lanka. Have a pleasant evening. We'll see you again next week at the same time with yet another edition of Hyde Park.